There's a pattern in history that doesn't announce itself with drums or banners. It arrives quietly, like a hairline crack under a marble statue. The statue still looks perfect from across the room, but the foundation is already failing. Over the last 500 years, that same hidden sequence has destroyed 3 global superpowers, not through conquest, but through something far more intimate, far more human: economics, overconfidence, and the slow addiction to borrowed power. And here's the part that should make you uncomfortable in 2025. The United States isn't just showing signs of the pattern, it's following it stage by stage, decision by decision, almost like we're reading from the same script that ended in catastrophe every time before. In 1590, Spain was the richest empire on earth. It controlled a massive share of the world's gold and silver. Its armies terrorized Europe. Its currency was accepted everywhere. Within 80 years, Spain was effectively bankrupt, reduced to a second-rate power that never truly recovered. In 1914, Britain ruled the largest empire in human history. The sun never set on British territory. The pound sterling was the global reserve currency. London was the heart of global finance. Within 40 years, the empire was unraveling. The currency weakened. Britain became America's junior partner.
Experience AI voice technology at vb.vn.
In 1991, the Soviet Union was the other pole of global power: nuclear weapons, satellites, influence across continents. It didn't lose a world war. It didn't get invaded. It ceased to exist in roughly 900 days, collapsing from internal economic implosion. 3 times, 3 superpowers. 3 collapses that didn't just rhyme, they followed the same sequence. And now the terrifying claim: the United States has already completed 5 of the 7 stages. We're not approaching the pattern, we're deep inside it. This is the story of how empires die, why they always believe they're different, and why, when you strip away the slogans and the national mythology, the math keeps pointing to the same destination. And it's happening faster than anyone wants to admit. Before we go through the pattern, you need to understand what imperial collapse actually looks like, not the simplified version you get in school. Rome fell. The empire declined. The barbarians arrived. Real collapse is uglier and more psychological than that, because imperial collapse doesn't begin with an invasion. It begins with economic exhaustion. The empire extends beyond its ability to maintain itself. It builds military bases across the world. It fights wars on multiple fronts.
Experience AI voice technology at vb.vn.
It makes promises it cannot keep. It accumulates debts it cannot repay. At first, the decline is invisible, almost polite. The currency still works. The military still wins battles. The government still speaks in confident sentences. But beneath the surface, the foundation is cracking. Resources get misallocated. Productive capacity shrinks. The talent either leaves or disengages. The society becomes more about extracting wealth than creating it. And then comes the acceleration. The moment the world stops pretending with you, allies begin to hedge, enemies begin to test boundaries, trade partners begin seeking alternatives. Reserve currency status, once treated like a law of nature, starts to erode, and suddenly, the very advantages that made you powerful become your greatest vulnerabilities. Your currency, once demanded everywhere, begins flooding back home. Your global military footprint, once a symbol of strength, becomes an unsustainable bill. Your promises, once guaranteed by power, become empty words. This isn't theory. It's an autopsy. It's what happened to Spain, Britain, and the Soviet Union. And it happened because they made the same choices we're making now. They believed their power was permanent. They overextended militarily. They weakened the integrity of their money. And they refused to accept reality until collapse was already underway. So let's watch the pattern unfold, 3 times, like a slow-motion replay. Spain, the original blueprint, 1500s, 1600s. Spain wasn't just rich. Spain was the first modern experiment in what happens when a nation gains access to world-changing wealth, before it has the discipline to handle it.
Voice generated by vb.vn.
After Columbus reached the Americas in 1492, Spain began swallowing entire civilizations. The Aztec and Inca empires collapsed under steel, disease, and conquest. And then came the prize, mines of gold and silver so vast they restructured global economics. By the mid-1500s, Spanish galleons were hauling oceans of silver back to Europe. This wasn't trade. This was the first great extraction machine of the modern age. Spain effectively controlled the money supply of Europe. The Spanish silver coin, the famous piece of 8, circulated across continents because people trusted it. And that's where the pattern begins. A country controls the money of the world and begins to believe that makes it invincible. Enter King Philip II. Ruling from 1556 to 1598, he inherited what looked like a divine gift, wealth beyond imagination, and he did what many empires do when they confuse money with inevitability. He spent it on empire. Stage 1, military overextension. Spain didn't fight one war, it fought everywhere, against the Ottoman Empire in the Mediterranean, against France and Italian rivals, against Protestant rebels in the Netherlands, what would become one of the most expensive, grinding conflicts of the era, against England's navy, culminating in disasters like the Armada in 1588, wars in the Philippines, wars across the Americas, coastal defenses, naval campaigns, permanent garrisons. By the late 1500s, Spain had military commitments across multiple continents, and here's the silent killer. The empire begins to exist for the purpose of maintaining the empire. Half of Spain's revenue went to the military, and still it wasn't enough, because when you build a global machine of power, it doesn't stop demanding fuel just because you're tired, it demands more. Forever. Stage 2, currency debasement. Spain had something most empires dream about, a flood of precious metal, but even that wasn't enough to pay the bills. So Spain did what failing empires do, not because they're evil, but because they're cornered.
VB.VN, Vietnam's leading text-to-speech solution.
They weakened the money, they began mixing cheaper metals into coinage. The face value stayed the same, but the real value fell. Stage 4 is where the illusion becomes lethal, because at this point, the empire doesn't just have problems, it has lost the ability to solve them, and Spain is the perfect blueprint for how this happens, because Spain didn't collapse from a lack of wealth, Spain collapsed because it had too much wealth in the wrong form, arriving too easily, with no pressure to build a real economy underneath. Stage 4, loss of productive capacity, Spain. Here's what people don't understand about Spain's fall. The gold and silver didn't save Spain, it ruined Spain, because when money arrives without production, a society's incentives invert. Why grow food when you can import it? Why build ships when you can buy them? Why innovate when you can simply pay? Spain's elite began to treat labor like a stain. Work was for peasants, for artisans, for lesser people. Meanwhile, Spain's rivals, England, the Dutch Republic, parts of France, were doing the opposite. They were building shipyards, creating markets, expanding manufacturing, developing finance and insurance, building the machinery of modern capitalism. Spain, instead, became a funnel. Silver arrived from the Americas, and left almost immediately.
Voice generated by VB.VN.
It paid for French wine, Italian silk, Dutch manufactured goods, German weapons, foreign grain. Spain was wealthy on paper, but hollow in reality, like a mansion with no foundation, beautiful until the first earthquake. By 1600, Spain was producing surprisingly little compared to the scale of its imperial commitments, and then the system revealed its fatal weakness. Spain wasn't an engine, it was a pipeline. So when the mines slowed, when shipments dropped, when costs rose and the wars continued, Spain didn't have a productive core to fall back on, and that's when the collapse moved from financial trouble to something more corrosive, social decay. Stage 5, social decay, Spain. This stage is never just about crime or poverty, it's about trust dissolving. Spain began to fracture socially. Beggars filled the streets of Madrid, crime rose as opportunity died, the productive fled, merchants, builders, innovators, the kind of people who create the next chapter of a nation's story. And what remained? A society top-heavy with consumers of wealth rather than creators of it. Bureaucrats, soldiers, priests, courtiers. An empire can survive corruption, it can survive inequality.
Voice generated by VB.VN.
It can even survive war, but it cannot survive a society where too many people are paid to manage decline instead of building growth. Then the political losses began. By 1640, Spain lost Portugal. By 1650, the Netherlands, its richest territory, was gone. By 1700, Spain still looked large on a map, but it was economically dead, a shell. The kind of empire that survives only because the paperwork hasn't caught up with reality. And here's the cruel poetic ending. Spain today is a beautiful country, cultured, historic, elegant, but not a global power. The descendants of the conquistadors live among museums and cathedrals and tourist streets, walking through the remains of what once controlled the world. That is what imperial collapse looks like. It doesn't always end in fire. Sometimes it ends in quiet irrelevance. Transition, the pattern moves forward. Now jump forward 300 years. New flag. New navy. New language. Same pattern. Britain in the 1900s, the empire where the sun never set. At its peak, Britain controlled roughly a quarter of the world's land and ruled hundreds of millions of people. The pound sterling was the global reserve currency. Major trade contracts were denominated in pounds. Central banks held British debt. London was the financial center of the world. And just like Spain centuries earlier, the British elite believed it would last forever, but they were already inside the sequence. Britain, the empire that paid for victory with its future. Stage 1, military overextension, Britain. By 1900, Britain had military commitments everywhere: India, Africa, the Middle East, China, the Pacific, the Caribbean, 6 continents, endless shipping lanes, endless colonies to police, and then, in 1914, the world detonated. World War I forced Britain into a choice that every empire eventually faces.
This audio is synthesized using AI technology from VB.VN.
Preserve wealth, or preserve dominance. Stay neutral and let Europe bleed itself out, or fight, and risk bankrupting the empire to win. Britain chose to fight, because that's what empires do when they're addicted to being the referee of the world. The war cost Britain staggering amounts, tens of billions in early 20th century money, translating into something like $1 trillion in today's scale. And Britain didn't pay for that war with stored treasure. It paid with loans, mostly from the United States. This is the moment the invisible power shift occurred. The creditor became the debtor. Britain still won, still kept its empire, and like Spain before it, Britain believed it could rebuild. But war leaves a scar deeper than ruins. War rearranges the financial hierarchy of the world. Stage 2, currency strain and debasement, Britain. The pound was supposed to be backed by gold, but the war drained Britain's reserves. Gold flowed out to pay for weapons, food, supplies, especially from America. By 1920, Britain's gold reserves were drastically weakened compared to 1914, but Britain tried to maintain the pound's prestige anyway, and this is where pride becomes policy. In 1925, Britain returned to the gold standard at the pre-war exchange rate.
This audio is synthesized using AI technology from VB.VN.
It was a symbolic move, an attempt to tell the world, we're still the center. But economics doesn't care about symbolism. The pound was effectively overvalued. That meant British exports were too expensive. Manufacturing suffered, unemployment rose, and the government had to keep interest rates high to defend the pound, squeezing domestic growth just to maintain an international illusion. It's the same dynamic you see later in other crises, when a nation sacrifices its real economy to preserve the appearance of currency strength. A documentary version of this would show 2 scenes side by side: a polished London bank office, and a shuttered factory town, because that's what defending a reserve currency can cost. By 1931, Britain couldn't hold it anymore. It abandoned the gold standard, and the pound fell sharply. This wasn't just a currency adjustment, this was a psychological event. The reserve currency had just admitted it couldn't keep its promise. And once that happens, the world starts preparing for a new center, because money is trust. And trust moves faster than armies. Now the empire was wounded, and the next stage, the stage that pushes wounded empires toward collapse, is the same one that haunted Spain. Debt. Britain had survived World War I, but it didn't recover from the bill. And then came the sequel, bigger, deadlier, and even more expensive, World War II. And when Britain entered that war, it was no longer paying with confidence, it was paying with the last remaining years of its empire.
Create professional voiceovers with VB.VN.
The moment the empire realizes it's broke, World War II is often remembered as a moral war, a war of freedom versus tyranny. But for Britain, it was also something colder, a financial event, a final stress test, and Britain passed the moral test, while failing the economic one, because empires don't die when they lose wars, they die when they win wars that they can no longer afford. Britain continued, victory that cost everything. Stage 3, the debt spiral, Britain entered World War II still carrying the financial hangover of World War I. And then the Second War arrived like a hammer, another wave of borrowing, another dependence on American industry, another transfer of gold, assets, and leverage across the Atlantic. By 1945, the numbers were brutal. Britain owed the United States and Canada enormous sums, so large that the debt burden eclipsed what Britain could realistically sustain without sacrificing its imperial system. In plain terms, the war was won, but the empire was finished. And here's the twist people miss. Britain didn't choose to give up the empire out of enlightenment or progress. It gave it up because it couldn't afford the police bill anymore. An empire is expensive even in peace. In war, it becomes impossible. Stage 4, loss of empire, Britain. The crown jewel was India, a vast market, a strategic hub, a symbol of dominance that had defined British power for 2 centuries. And in 1947, India was gone, not as a gradual reform, as a rupture, partition, chaos, displacement, an ending that felt like the empire tearing itself apart on the way out. Then the rest came quickly: Africa, the Middle East, Southeast Asia, the Caribbean. Within a few decades, the British Empire existed mostly as memory. Maps were redrawn, flags changed, and Britain discovered something psychologically devastating. You can keep the institutions of power, while losing the substance of power. A permanent UN Security Council seat, nuclear weapons, a special relationship with America. But those were symbols, not the engine. By 1970, the empire, the actual mechanism of global control, was gone. And once empire fades, currency often follows. Stage 5, currency decline, Britain. The pound kept weakening, not in a single dramatic Hollywood collapse, but in a slow erosion that told the world.
Text-to-speech platform by VB.VN.
The center is shifting. Britain tried to maintain the posture of a global power, but the truth was visible in every exchange rate chart. A reserve currency doesn't just represent wealth, it represents belief, and belief had moved across the Atlantic. Britain became something haunting, a museum of former greatness. The palaces remained, the ceremonies remained, but the world's financial gravity had changed, and it never changed back. Transition, the most recent collapse, the Soviet Union. Now we move to the modern era. The collapse people still can't fully process, because it happened not centuries ago, but within living memory. The Soviet Union, 1945 to 1991. After World War II, the USSR emerged as a superpower. Nuclear weapons, control over Eastern Europe, a global ideological mission. They believed history was on their side. Communism would bury capitalism. For 45 years, they competed with the United States across the planet. Tanks, missiles, troops, space programs, proxy wars. But beneath the parades and propaganda, the economy was rotting.
Text-to-speech platform by VB.VN.
Because the Soviet system had a fundamental weakness: it could command, but it could not innovate. And in the modern world, stagnation is death. USSR, the superpower that collapsed from the inside. Stage 1, military overextension. USSR. The Soviet Union spent an enormous share of GDP on the military, often estimated around 15 to 20%. That's not just a lot, that's a society choosing weapons over everything else. Over housing, over consumer goods, over infrastructure, over technological competitiveness. And they weren't just defending themselves, they were projecting power. Afghanistan, Cuba, Syria, Vietnam, North Korea, Angola, Ethiopia, everywhere America had influence. The USSR felt compelled to counter, because in a bipolar world, loss anywhere feels like loss everywhere. But here's the problem: America was spending from a larger economic base, the USSR was spending from a smaller one. So every new missile was heavier than it looked, every new deployment came with an invisible cost, a factory not modernized, a farm left inefficient, a civilian economy starved. Stage 2, economic stagnation, USSR. By the 1970s, Soviet growth was slowing hard. Oil revenue kept them alive, But oil is not an economy, it's a lifeline. Factories produced low-quality goods, technology lagged, agriculture faltered. By the 1980s, the Soviet Union, a country with some of the richest farmland on Earth, was importing grain.
Create professional voiceovers with VB.VN.
That single fact is an economic horror story, because it reveals a deeper law. When incentives die, production dies. Central planning can mobilize resources for war, but it struggles to produce prosperity, because prosperity requires signals, prices, competition, reward, risk, experimentation. In the Soviet model, the system punished deviation, so innovation suffocated, and when innovation suffocates, the future belongs to someone else. Stage 3, Currency Failure, USSR. The ruble was never a true global currency. It couldn't be freely exchanged on world markets. Even Soviet citizens didn't fully trust it. And when people don't trust their own money, they start hoarding something else. Dollars, gold, goods, anything real. The Soviet government had to buy foreign goods with hard assets, gold and oil, because nobody wanted rubles. And then a critical moment arrived. In the mid-1980s, oil prices dropped. Suddenly the lifeline weakened. Gold reserves began depleting. They were running out of the only real money the outside world accepted. At that moment, the Soviet Union wasn't just struggling, it was approaching the edge of solvency. Stage 4, Loss of Empire, USSR. In 1989, the Berlin Wall fell.
Create professional voiceovers with VB.VN.
That wasn't just a political symbol, that was the Soviet perimeter collapsing. Within a year, Eastern Europe began slipping away. Poland, Hungary, Czechoslovakia, Romania, East Germany, gone. The Soviet Union could not stop it, not because it didn't have tanks, but because it didn't have cash. An empire can threaten, but if it can't pay its soldiers, the threats become theater. Stage 5, Complete Collapse, USSR. And then it happened. December 26, 1991, the Soviet Union ceased to exist. Not after a world war, not after invasion, but after internal economic implosion. The state couldn't function, the military couldn't be paid, the ruble became worthless, the political structure shattered, a superpower with tens of thousands of nuclear weapons collapsed from within, and the timeline was shocking. Roughly 900 days from the fall of the Berlin Wall to dissolution. That's what stage 5 can become when the system loses belief. Collapse isn't always gradual. Sometimes it's sudden, like a building that looks stable until the exact moment it isn't. Now we've seen it 3 times. Spain, Britain, the USSR, different systems, different centuries, different ideologies, same sequence. And this is where the story turns toward the present. Because the uncomfortable claim is not that America might follow the pattern someday, it's that America is already following it now, stage by stage. And if you want to understand why the next chapters could arrive faster than anyone expects, you have to look at the United States the same way we just looked at them.
Synthetic voice by VB.VN.
Not as a myth, not as an identity, but as a system with numbers, and systems that run on numbers don't care how patriotic you feel, they care whether the structure still holds. So let's move into the American stages, and let's start where every imperial decline begins. Stage 1, Military Overextension. America enters the same 7 doors. Stage 1 is always the easiest to deny, because it doesn't feel like collapse, it feels like strength. It feels like global responsibility, like leadership, like being the only adult left in the room. But history has a darker name for it: overextension. And every empire, every single one, believes it can carry more than the laws of economics allow, until it can't. The United States, Stage 1, Military Overextension. The United States has built the most expansive military footprint in human history. Hundreds of bases spread across the planet, troops positioned in dozens upon dozens of countries, security commitments layered on top of each other like insurance policies written in a moment of confidence. Defend Europe through NATO, defend Japan, defend South Korea, support allies in the Pacific, maintain presence in the Middle East, deter Russia, contain China, guarantee global shipping lanes. It's not a military, it's a global operating system, and it is expensive in ways most people never fully grasp, because the cost isn't only the visible number on the Pentagon budget.
Text-to-speech platform by VB.VN.
The cost is readiness, logistics, recruitment, replacement, modernization, and the deeper cost is something that never shows up on a news ticker. Strategic attention. When you're committed everywhere, you're fully prepared nowhere. In 2025, the US military budget sits in the neighborhood of the highest on Earth, larger than many rivals combined, and still it doesn't feel like enough. Equipment is aging, recruitment struggles, fatigue accumulates after decades of continuous deployments and endless missions with unclear endings. And here's the nightmare scenario that every overextended empire eventually faces: multiple crises at once. If China moves on Taiwan, if Russia pressures NATO, if the Persian Gulf destabilizes, if supply chains fracture, the question becomes simple and brutal. Can you respond to all of it simultaneously? Spain couldn't, Britain couldn't, the Soviet Union couldn't. Overextension doesn't announce collapse. It quietly erodes options. It forces an empire to choose which promise to break first. And when the world sees broken promises, the next stage is accelerate.
Text-to-speech platform by VB.VN.
Stage 1, check. Now we move to the stage that always follows military overreach. Because military systems demand money, and when taxes can't cover it, the temptation is ancient: weaken the currency. Stage 2, currency debasement. In old empires, debasement was literal. They shaved coins, mixed copper into silver, reduced purity while keeping the face value. Today, we don't mix metal, we expand digits. In 1971, the United States closed the gold window. That wasn't just a policy moment, it was a historical pivot. The dollar became a fiat currency, money backed not by a metal, but by trust, institutions, and American power. In theory, that's not automatically collapse. Fiat systems can work, but they carry a permanent temptation. If you can create money, you can postpone pain, and postponed pain is politically addictive. Over the past decades, especially after crises, money supply expansion became a tool not just for stability, but for survival. After 2008, the world learned a new language: quantitative easing. After 2020, that language became a flood. Trillions created rapidly, debt expanding, asset prices inflating, cost of living pressure rising. And here's the psychological trick that makes this stage so dangerous: debasement doesn't feel like robbery.
Voice generated by VB.VN.
It feels like relief, until it shows up in the grocery bill, in rent, in healthcare costs, in the slow realization that the same paycheck buys less life each year. The mechanism is different from Spain's copper coins, but the result rhymes. The integrity of the currency declines. Stage 2, check. Then comes the stage where the math begins to trap you, because once you debase and borrow to fund promises, you enter the spiral. Stage 3, debt spiral. Debt is not inherently evil. Empires borrow. Businesses borrow. Households borrow. Debt becomes fatal when it stops funding growth and starts funding the past. When borrowing exists not to build the future, but to maintain the illusion of the present. The United States carries national debt measured in the tens of trillions, but the truly ominous number is not the total, it's the interest. Interest payments rising toward levels that start competing with core government functions. That's when debt stops being a line item and becomes a gravitational force, because you reach a point where you borrow simply to pay interest on what you already borrowed.
Voice generated by VB.VN.
That's not politics, that's a spiral. Spain defaulted repeatedly when it couldn't pay. Britain borrowed until the empire bled out. The USSR ran out of real money and the structure shattered. Debt creates a hidden vulnerability. It reduces flexibility. It turns shocks into crises. A recession becomes a fiscal emergency. A war becomes a financial avalanche. A higher interest rate becomes a budget killer. And modern markets notice. The same way lenders once watched Spain and eventually demanded more. The world watches America's numbers now. Stage 3, check. Now we reach the stage that looks like an economic statistic, but behaves like a national weakening. Because when you stop making things, you stop being self-sustaining. Stage 4, loss of productive capacity. This is where empires quietly become dependent. The United States still designs, innovates, and dominates certain sectors, but the deeper issue is industrial muscle. For decades, manufacturing migrated outward. Production moved to China, Mexico, Vietnam, and other low-cost centers. Supply chains lengthened. Domestic resilience shrank. and now America imports enormous quantities of what it consumes, often more than it exports. This is not just about jobs, it's about sovereignty, because if you rely on foreign supply chains for medicine, electronics, steel, critical minerals, even components used in defense systems, then your ability to act independently is compromised. This is the Spain problem. Updated, Spain imported goods while silver flowed out. America imports goods while dollars flow out, and as long as the world wants to hold dollars, that can persist. But if stage 6 arrives, if the world needs fewer dollars, then the imbalance becomes a trap. Stage 4, check. Now we arrive at the stage that feels cultural, political, even emotional.
Voice generated by VB.VN.
But it's also economic. Because societies can't sustain empires when the social fabric is tearing. Stage 5, social decay. This is the stage where the empire begins to feel exhausted, not just financially, spiritually. Trust in institutions sinks. Political dysfunction hardens into permanent paralysis. Communities fracture. Symptoms multiply. Homelessness rising, overdose deaths straining entire regions, crime concerns returning in many cities, fertility rates falling, loneliness increasing, civic trust collapsing, and beneath all of it is the deeper signal. A society that no longer agrees on what's real cannot coordinate, it cannot build, it cannot reform, it cannot sacrifice, it can only argue, and that's the terrifying part about stage 5. It makes stage 6 easier, because reserve currency status isn't just about GDP or military power, it's about credibility, it's about whether the world trusts your system will still function tomorrow. Stage 5, check, 5 out of 7, and this is the moment the story turns from unsettling.
Voice generated by VB.VN.
To dangerous, because stage 6 is not a vibe, it's a global financial shift. It's the moment the world starts diversifying away, not overnight, not dramatically at first, but quietly, steadily, and once that motion reaches a tipping point, the final stage is no longer theoretical. Stage 6 is the loss of reserve currency status. Stage 7 is collapse, and the reason you should fear those stages is simple. They do not arrive gradually, they arrive like confidence falling through a trapdoor. So now we need to talk about stage 6, the one that turns an internal problem into a global event, because the early signs are already forming, and the world is already rehearsing what comes next.